Well, I'm Dr. Jim Del Rosso, the current president of the American Acne and Rosacea Society, an organization that I've been involved with since its inception, have served on the education committee and the board of directors, and previously, years ago, as the president of the society. And I'm back for a second run at that. It started in March 2024 at the most recent annual AAD meeting. But I can tell you, this feels like the first time in honor of one of my favorite rock and roll bands, Foreigner, who just got into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That was their first big release and hit. So hopefully I'll have a hit for you today, and that's to review Bimekizumab, which Bimzelx, which is for subcutaneous injection, just recently FDA approved for moderate to severe hidradenitis suppurativa in adults. Now, I am speaking as an individual with this data and not necessarily the opinion of the American Acne and Rosacea Society. So I have been involved with the evaluation of bimekizumab, which is the brand name Bimzelx for hidradenitis suppurativa, really throughout its course. And with this particular agent was involved in a lot of the preparation discussions even before it gained its first approval for moderate to severe plaque psoriasis in patients who are candidates for systemic therapy. So it does have that previous approval and also has approval in adults for psoriatic arthritis and axial spondyloarthropathies. So the dosing is different between these three distinct indications. So it's important to recognize that when you're looking at a patient with hidradenitis suppurativa, and we'll get into the dosing for that disease individual. So it's approved for moderate to severe hidradenitis suppurativa in adults based on pivotal trials, which I'll be getting through that information. And prior to prescribing it, it is important, first of all, to have patients up to date on their age appropriate vaccines. That's recommended essentially with all these different monoclonal antibodies that we use for psoriasis, hidradenitis suppurativa, and even Janus kinase inhibitors that we use for different entities. That's a standard recommendation. Have patients up to date on their age appropriate vaccines. Prior to starting Bimzelx for hidradenitis suppurativa, as with the other indications, evaluate for, for tuberculosis at baseline, and that's typically done with a blood test such as a quantiferon gold. It's recommended that at baseline that you have liver function testing, and that would include transaminase enzymes, alkaline phosphatase, and bilirubin. Avoid administration with live vaccines. And that's also a standard recommendation with all these different monoclonal antibodies that we use, typically for psoriasis, atopic dermatitis, and now hidradenitis suppurativa, and also with other agents like Janus kinase inhibitors, because as in this case with Bimzelx, bimekizumab, it's not been studied with live vaccines. That being said, they think very intelligently, in my opinion, that it was good to do some evaluation with vaccines. So they actually did a study, and it's in the package insert, the prescribing information, where the Bimzelx was applied 2 weeks prior to administering an inactivated seasonal influenza flu vaccine. So these were healthy subjects that received a 320 milligram injection, which is the standard dose used for hidradenitis suppurativa and also psoriasis. Uh, and they administered it, and 2 weeks later, they administered the patient that inactivated influenza vaccine and saw there was no difference. So, at least in this evaluation, the Bimzelx did not interfere with the antibody response to that flu vaccine. And I think that was a wise thing to look at. So let's talk about the pivotal trials that were done to evaluate Bimzelx for hidradenitis suppurativa. And you could find the results of the multi-center phase 3 trials with bimekizumab for moderate to severe hidradenitis suppurativa. They're called the BHERD 1 and the BHERD 2 trials, and they were published by Alexa Kimball and other colleagues in the Lancet in the May 22nd, 2024 issue. So this information is public knowledge, and out there for publication. And that's the source of a lot of the data that we're going to be talking about here. So what types of patients were in the trial? They had to be rated as having at least moderate or severe hidradenitis suppurativa, and they had to be adults, meaning they were 18 years of age and older. They used the Hurley stages, which are the classic stages of looking at patients with hidradenitis suppurativa and rating them as either Hurley stage 1, 2, or 3. And that's based on the visible appearance of what you're seeing in these patients. And Hurley stage 1 is where patients can have abscesses and nodules, but no sinus tracts or scarring. So that's Hurley stage 1. To be in this study, these patients were Hurley stage 2 or Hurley stage 3, in which case they've had abscesses or nodules. They had them at the time of evaluation, but already had visible evidence or clinical evidence of sinus tracts and scarring. And the difference between Hurley stage 2 and Hurley stage 3 was the extent of that involvement. So Hurley stage 3, it was very diffuse in the areas of involvement. Now, recognize these patients typically have involvement of the axilla, the groin genital area, under the breasts, places where they have friction. And very importantly, if you look at the patients that were in the study, these patients had a pretty high body mass index, which is something that is common in patients with hidradenitis suppurativa. They tend to be overweight and obese, which is actually a risk factor for development and progression of the disease, as is smoking. And many of the patients in the trial were also smokers, either past or current smokers. So the way this is done in the evaluations is, first of all, these patients had a mean age of about 72 years of age. There was about a 60-40 split of females to males, and they had a mean number of draining tunnels of about 3.6 or so entering into the study, and a mean abscess and nodule count of 16 to 17, depending on which group they were in each of those trials. So they had a significant amount of clinical involvement. The breakdown between Hurley stage 2 and Hurley stage 3 in the trials was 56% Hurley stage 2 and 44% Hurley stage 3. Remember, these patients had abscesses and nodules and also sinus tracts and scarring. The median duration of disease prior to entering into the study was 5 years. Now, these patients are often treated with concomitant antibiotics. So, in order to allow concomitant antibiotics in the trial, they had to be on a stable dose of an antibiotic. Let's say a doxycycline, for example, would be commonly used in this situation. They had to be on a stable dose for at least 28 days before coming into the trial, and they were could be maintained on that throughout the trial at that same dose. And if you look at the study, about 1 out of 10 patients were on those concomitant antibiotics. So most of the patients were not on any concomitant antibiotics. If they needed an antibiotic initiated during the study, but they did not enter into the study on that antibiotic, then that would be considered a non-responder. Also, about 2 out of 10 patients had previously been on biologic agents for hidradenitis suppurativa, but they had to be off of those for a requisite period of time before entering to the study. Most of the patients had not been treated with previous biologic therapy. That was most likely going to be a TNF inhibitor because adalimumab has been approved for hidradenitis in this group of patients, in this type of patient for quite some time. More recently, secukinumab, which is an anti-IL-17A inhibitor, does not also inhibit IL-17F like bimekizumab does, was approved more recently and not likely included in the past in these patients. So if you look at the demographic breakdown, uh, you had about 1/3 were actually Black or African American in the United States, even though if you look at across all the study sites, it was about 11%. So we had a pretty good view of not only Caucasian patients in the study, at least in the United States. And 46% of them were current smokers. So about half of them were smokers, and smoking is a risk factor for increased severity and progression of hidradenitis suppurativa. So there wasn't cherry picking of patients that would be more likely to respond. So when you look at what happened in this particular study, the mean body mass index going into the study was 33. And once you get to 30 or greater, that's considered in the overweight, obese category. So this fits the clinical picture, though not all patients necessarily present in that fashion. The mean body mass index was 33. So it goes with the population of patients that typically develop hidradenitis suppurativa. When we look at the criteria to evaluate the response, there has been some information that Alexa Kimball and even some others have published that has really upgraded how we assess hidradenitis suppurativa, as you will see done in these Bimzelx trials. So very often there's been a hidradenitis suppurativa physician global assessment, which rates baseline, and then at a certain time point after, let's say 16 weeks, the patients that got to clear, minimal, or mild with at least a 2-grade improvement. And that's based on the visual assessment. What's been upgraded is to go to the hidradenitis suppurativa clinical response score. And what's been used typically as the threshold bar with the FDA is to have a 50% reduction in that score, which collectively looks at different parameters. But the main thing this looks at is the number of abscesses and nodules, right? So you have to have at least a 50% reduction in those abscesses and nodule counts from baseline to, let's say, week 16, if that's where you're looking at the primary endpoint, in that high score, the hidradenitis suppurativa clinical response score. But in the studies, if the patient has any increase in abscesses or draining fistulas as compared to baseline, regardless of the reduction in the abscess and nodule count, they're not considered a responder. So this is very important because it looks at what's actually going on beneath, because hidradenitis is a situation that's able to produce draining fistulas, sinus tracts, scarring, and fibrosis underneath what we're seeing clinically. So if we're only looking at it visibly and doing abscess and nodule counts, we're not considering the whole perspective of the disease. So let's talk about how the BHERD-1 and BHERD-2 studies were done, evaluating adults with moderate to severe hidradenitis suppurativa, moderate to severe disease involvement with the parameters and demographics and baseline considerations that I just discussed. So there are over 1,000 patients included in 176 sites worldwide in these phase 2 randomized controlled double-blind studies. So in BHERD-1, there were 505 patients. In BHERD-2, 509 patients. Jim Del Lasso likes to pride himself on not having to look at notes, but there's far too many details to keep in this elderly brain. But I think at any time in life, I want to make sure I have the information correct. So if you look at how the studies were done, they evaluated patients that were treated with Bimzelx 300 milligrams by injection every 2 weeks versus every 4 weeks versus placebo. And then that was evaluated out to week 16, where the primary endpoint was looked at. And we'll talk about that with the high score results uh, soon. Okay, I'm getting to that soon. Believe me, I'm getting to it soon. Uh, and then they looked at going beyond 16 weeks to week 48 weeks, which is where they evaluated whether it was going to be necessary to keep it at every 2 weeks or whether you can go to every 4 weeks. And so that's how they ultimately determined, based on looking at the results, that the way it's recommended that it be dosed that's in the prescribing information is that from baseline through week 16, the patient is given the Bimzelx 320 milligrams at each visit every 4 weeks going out to week 16. And then at week 16, the patient could be changed to the 320 milligrams every 8 weeks. So you could extend out the frequency of administration. And that is the way the dosing is specified in the approved product labeling in the package insert. So if you look at the package insert, you'll see that. That's because they found that administering every 4 weeks after week 16 worked as well as every 2 weeks in terms of efficacy and also by safety evaluation. So when you look at what the actual results were, and the primary endpoint is the hidradenitis uh, score, the clinical response score of 50% reduction. So these patients would have had to have 50% reduction in their abscess and nodule count from baseline to week 16 and not have any increase in abscesses or draining fistulas as compared to the baseline. If they did, it didn't matter what those abscess and nodule decreases were. So when you look at in both of the studies, in the first trial, BHERD 1, uh, just shy of 50%, 48% of the patients reached that high score of 50% reduction in the disease as compared to 29%. So about 5 out of 10 reached that endpoint that received the Bimzelx versus 3 out of 10 in the placebo. And it was very close to that in the second study. It was 52 with Bimzelx, 52% versus 32% with placebo. Now, they also looked at 75% reduction in that hidradenitis clinical response score. What's called the high score, you'll see that written as HISCR, and the number next to it tells you the reduction in that score. So the high score 75 is a 75% reduction. And that was achieved in 33 to 36% of the patients treated with Bimzelx in both the studies, as compared to 16 to 18% in the placebo group, the range in both of the studies. So based on the high score 50 and the high score 75, you can see here that the Bimzelx was superior to the placebo, and that supported its FDA approval based on efficacy. There is other data that is available. I'm not going to spend time going over a lot of it now. They actually looked at high score 100 and was able to show that some patients actually achieved almost 1 out of 4 by week 16. If you looked at the pooled observed cases in the studies, and going out to 4 out of 10 at week 42 received a high score of 90. And then just about 2 out of 10 going to 3 out of 10 from week 16 to week 48. You're seeing achieving complete clearance based on the high score. So there is additional data that's based on the observed case pooled results. Now, the other thing that's important, if you look at the week 16 data, the patients that were every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, and certainly there was a placebo arm, 82% of the patients that went on to week 48 and were receiving the Bimzelx, okay, 82% of them reported having no flares over the course of the subsequent year going out to week 48. So that was important information. Also, there's quality of life data that was collected. Uh, the mean score in looking at the hidradenitis quality of life parameters, which is more precise to hidradenitis suppurativa, evaluating pain, interfering with function, psychosocial effects, itching, all the different things that can affect these patients. They went from a high score, a severe score of 24 from in the beginning to mild over 48 weeks. And by week 16, got to mild. So these patients improved in terms of quality of life and also significant reductions in pain.